Hey all, and welcome back to Puzzle Gaming and my League Starter build for 322. Now this time around we're going with a Rain of Arrows champion. Rain of Arrows is a great League start skill that I've used for the last couple of leagues. It really works well with a lot of Ascendancies because although it's a bow skill, it doesn't need things like extra projectiles, chain, fork or pierce to work. So it does work really well on Ascendancies other than a Deadeye, which is what you normally have to go for your bow builds. As I say, we're pairing this with Champion Ascendancy to get access to Fortify, Adrenaline, a big buff to auras and defenses. Now this is a build I've tested in both an SSF and trade environment and been able to pick up the first 2 Void Stones and complete the Atlas on very cheap gear. So this video guide is designed to be a quick overview and introduction to the build, but to support it, there's detailed act by act POBs and a very detailed written guide so that you can dive deeper into the parts of the build that you need more help on. All of this material is linked in the video description. So let's start with the pros and cons of the build. In terms of the pros, as I've explained, the build works really well in SSF gear and it's very simple to progress and complete your Atlas and beginner friendly. With a combination of Fortify, big armor and evasion and Adrenaline, it offers a great all-round mix of defenses and attack. It should be very good at Sanctum. It has very, very high movement speed, good defenses, and good enough single target damage. It can push to red maps on junk gear and a 5-link, and then transition to crit, spend around 100 cows investment, and you should be able to get your first 2 pinnacle bosses down and clear your Atlas. Leveling from Act 1 is super smooth. In terms of cons, single target is not the best, but it's adequate, but it's not going to be something where you're going to be able to push to end game without any consideration towards your gear. Once you've cleared your Atlas and got your Void Stones, you are going to need to make a bit of investment to kill Uber Elder and Maven and make it so that you can farm invitations. I would think at estimate 10 to 12 divines will get you the build finished. You can obviously scale that further if you want more damage, more speed, more defenses, but you honestly don't need to spend any more than that on the character at all. And you'll then have a character that can comfortably farm nearly any content that you want to do. So while we're on the subject of nearly any content, because the single target is hard to scale massively, it's not going to do things like Uber Boss, Wave 30 Simulacrums and 100% Deli, but as it's a League start build, no one really aims these builds at this sort of content. It's designed to be a mapper. It can kill bosses, but I would recommend if you follow this guide, you're someone that likes to map. If you're someone that just wants to boss early league, this probably isn't the build for you. So before we jump into trees and gear, let's talk about some key mechanics of the build. The first is Adrenaline. We're going to come on to how to proc this later, but Adrenaline is an absolutely insane buff that gives us huge increases to attack speed, movement speed, and damage. It also gives you 10% physical damage reduction. We're also going to make use of Mana Forge arrows, not really for the damage, more for the utility. When we transition to crit, we're going to be getting power charges and frenzy charges automatically from Mana Forged arrows. Point Blank is a keystone that I use on this build. You don't have to. It essentially gives you 30% more damage if you are right on top of the enemy. And with Rain of Arrows combined with our defenses, there isn't really many scenarios where you can't stand there and trade with a boss. In terms of early game, before you go to crit, we're going to be utilizing the Precise Technique keystone, again to get big more multipliers to our damage. All you have to do here is make sure that your accuracy is above your life. There is lots of ways you can ensure you do this. There are masteries that will take in the path of building. There are nodes on the tree that give us accuracy. You can take a precision gem to give you even more. It's not very difficult early on to get 4 to 5k accuracy, which will definitely be more than your life. And then once you move away from Precise Technique, we're going to be scaling crit. And we do that in lots of different ways. We're going to be using Mana Forge arrows to get power charges, Precision to give a crit boost. We're going to be taking nodes on the tree that blind enemies and give us crit chance on blind. Overall, combined with the Diamond Flask, you should be able to get somewhere around 80% crit chance even on pretty average gear. In terms of your leveling, as I've explained, you're going to use Precise Technique and Point Blank to get big boost to your early damage. And this setup works really well to late tier yellow, early tier red maps. Once you get to level 85, that's when I recommend switching to crit. Crit gives us a big boost to damage once we get to around level 85 and we've got enough points to take the crit nodes that we want on the tree. It far outperforms the Precise Technique version at this stage. In terms of your gear, you're going to clear an Atlas on a 5-link and fairly well optimized crit gear, but if you craft it yourself, which there is full details in the written guide, I would think you won't need to spend any more than 80 to 100 chaos, and you're going to have your gear ready to pick up your first 2 void stones and clear your Atlas. Once you can afford a 6-link and you can start to push to your more end game gear, red maps are going to be super comfortable. You're going to have good enough damage, really good defenses, and lots of speed. It's this version of the build you're going to use to farm the currency to put together the 10 to 12 divine finished version, which you can then use to farm pretty much any content you want, apart from the really high aspirational difficult content, such as Uber bosses, Simulacrum, and high juiced Delhi maps. So let's go over the skill tree and your endgame links. For your main skill, you're going to be using Vaal Rain of Arrows. We'll touch on what the Vaal version does later on. You're going to be supporting that with critical strike damage, Mirage Archer, Trinity, Inspiration, and Ellie damage with attacks. In terms of your damage support and utility, we're not going to use ballistas because they just take time to put down. You don't really need them for single target damage, for mapping content and even bosses and invitations. So we're going to go with a Maniforged Arrows setup. So you're going to run Burning Arrow because it gives big damage, Frenzy to generate frenzy charges, and then you're going to support it with Power Charge on crit, Inspiration, and Maniforged Arrows. If you have a 6-link bow, you can just add in another bow skill that does decent damage, so just something like Lightning Arrow. And then if we go and have a look at this setup, or we'll just click full DPS, it will show us. So you can see just from this setup alone, you've got 1 million DPS when you're attacking, and ballistas would be more than that, but you have to put them down. They sometimes die. This just makes it nice and easy. Whenever you attack, your Maniforged Arrow setup is going to go off, trigger all of these skills. It's going to be nice and comfy. We're going to run just a single Molten Shell on left click because we don't have the sockets to fit anything else in. You've got your setup to proc Corrupting Fever. Again, we'll come onto that in more detail. You have a mark setup of Sniper's Mark, Life Tap, Mark on Hit, and then just a Flame Dash for movement skill. So I'll just touch on auras. The recommended all-rounder would be Grace and Determination, but you honestly don't need the extra evasion. You lose 10% chance to evade by not running Grace. So we see evade chance here is 92%. If we drop Grace, it goes down to 81. So we lose 11% chance to evade. But we have such big defenses that even if you get hit, there should be very little that can kill you. But if you wanted to level to 100, for example, while you're doing your mapping strategy, you may as well run Grace. DPS is about 1 million. This is per arrow and you'll land with multiple arrows. If you wanted to run something that makes you quicker through maps, you can run Haste. You don't gain any DPS because you get a boost of the DPS from the evasion we gain from Grace because of the unique belt, which we'll come onto in the gearing section. But it obviously increases our movement speed and attack speed. So with Haste up, we go from 159% movement speed to 188. If you're bossing, I would recommend running Anger. It's a bigger damage increase. Grace, not as good on boss fights. And as I said, you don't need it. So if you want to push your DPS to go and kill, let's say, Maven or Uber Elder, I'd recommend running a damage aura like Anger or Wrath or whatever you can fit in with your attributes. But just for your comfy, safe mapping, I'd recommend Grace. If you want to go super quick, go Haste, bossing, Anger. So we'll just run over the tree. This is your end game tree when you've got your 10 to 12 divines worth of gear. This is a tree I would recommend. The cluster jewel, there are loads of different ones we can use, so don't feel you have to get this exact one because it's likely, if everyone follows the build, it's going to be super expensive, but other ones that are equally as good might be 20 to 30 chaos. So we will touch over what I'd recommend running. In the written guide, there will be alternatives to use for different cluster jewels. So in terms of the tree, we come straight down and take Art of the Gladiator. It's a really good node. Get attack speed, accuracy, and we ignore the penalties you get from running armor. We're going to run an armor and evasion base, so you do get a small movement speed penalty for running those bases. We just take life, evasion, and armor. We come down here and get projectile speed, damage, and strength. I would recommend running Graceful Assault. It doesn't do huge amounts of DPS, but if we look at your buffs here for your defenses, 27 and 61. If you don't run that, it goes down to 51 and 24. So for 3 points, it's well worth it. It will also give you movement speed and attack speed because it scales our onslaught, which we have permanently. These nodes are absolutely huge for critical strike chance. If you're really, really well geared, you might not need them. But these essentially just give you a massive boost to crit strike chance against blinded enemies and gives you chance to blind enemies. Because we hit enemies with so many arrows, you're going to be blinding every enemy instantly. We go down to take point blank. Again, if you're someone that wants to keep your distance, don't pick this keystone. Into our first cluster jewel setup. What you want is an 8 passive cluster with 3 notables, because what this allows you to do is just use 5 points to path to get your medium clusters. And really the main purpose of our large cluster jewel is to get medium ones into play because they're big damage boosts. And we then get the 2 jewel sockets where we can fit in the jewels that we need for the build. So I'm running Sadist because this gives me damage against shocked, chilled and igniting enemies and will do all 3 damage types. And Prismatic Heart for more LE damage and more resistance. As I said, there's lots of different cluster jewels you could use. You can use bow clusters, attack clusters. You might lose 2% DPS, but you might save yourself 2 to 3 divines if these jewels end up being expensive. You will get an 8 passive cluster that can suit the build, I would think, for 30 to 40 chaos. In there, we're slotting medium jewels, which you can either buy or craft yourself just with alterations and regals. They're super easy. And we're using eye to eye if you use point blank, because it's again more damage to close enemies, and repeater. If you're not running point blank, you could run something like streamlined, which is increased projectile damage and speed. We're using the same cluster jewel in both. Just make sure it's not a 6 passive jewel. You want 4 or 5 so that you don't have to spend an extra travel point. We'll come on to the jewels in a moment. Here we're getting life and more life. This wheel here is just proj, critical strike chance and multi. Getting another life wheel here along with a mastery to get 15% life if there's no life on body armor, which you don't want to have. We will come on to the body armor separately. And then we're going through here to get lots and lots of suppression, movement speed, damage, then some stats, mana and life. Then over to more bow nodes. Coming up to get the reservation efficiency we need on the build, along with increased aura effect. Then we take life and evasion here, and then 15% chance to suppress spell damage if we have evasion on all our gear. All of your gear should be armor and evasion hybrid gear. We're going to get forces of nature for big elemental penetration, and then this mastery, which is 25% chance to avoid elemental resistances. We then go up the other way, take our crit bow nodes, along with a mastery to make increases in projectile speed give us damage. As you can see, it's quite a big mastery, 5% more damage by adding this mastery in, and I don't have really any projectile speed on my gear. You're going to take a brutal restraint here, which we'll come on to shortly, and then just the crit nodes and more crit multi. We take this big suppression wheel here, along with suppress chance is lucky. With that, these suppression nodes on the tree here, and this 15% here, we don't need any suppression on gear to hit 95% chance to suppress spell damage. You can cap your spell suppression on gear if you like, but it's going to be much more expensive to gear. So if you drop this node, for example, you can see the suppression goes down to 78%. So you're going to need to find 22% on gear, or if you're happy to give up 2 life nodes or something else, you could take these nodes here, and then you don't need very much on gear at all. But in softcore, I'm happy with 95% chance to evade, and I think you're going to be absolutely fine with it because of the other defenses that we have in the build. And then lastly, we just come up and get the mana, leech, life leech, instant leech, and life. The reason I've gone up here instead of just taking these nodes down here is because the little bit of mana gain on hit can really help you if you get into no leech maps and no regen maps. If you don't have these nodes and you just have normal leech down here, any no regen maps and any no leech maps are going to feel really bad. Just these little life and mana on hit is going to be enough to get you through those map mods. So it is a couple more points to go up here, but it just means you have less mods to worry about on your maps. And then in terms of the unique jewels, you want Watcher's Eye with precision damage or precision attack speed, whatever's cheapest. If these are more than a divine, I probably wouldn't bother. Just go for like a rare jewel. Again, Ancestral Vision to cap our elemental ailments. This is optional. I just don't like not being ailment immune. If these are multiple divines, like 3+ divines, don't bother. It just means we don't need to do much with gear to get us ailment avoidance. If you decide you don't want to go ailment avoidance, there are ways to get reduced effect of shock, immune to chill, immune to frozen, which I think is good enough, which we'll go through later. And then with your brutal restraint, there's not really anything specific you need. Loads and loads of nodes on brutal restraints are good for damage. You can get, so if we just go through my one, for example, we've got projectile damage, we have increased effect of non-curse auras, blind on hit, increased critical strike chance, blind on hit again, damage of poison doesn't do anything, chance to gain alchemist genius, which gives your flask more effect. There's just tons and tons of good nodes. Again, this gem is optional. You can put whatever you want in there. And that covers off the tree that I would go for at endgame. I'm not going to go through the other trees because there is your leveling tree, there's your non-crit version. These will all be in the POB and described in detail in the written guide, so I recommend you go there. The final POB is going to have act by act trees and different gear and gem setup so that you know exactly what you need to do for each section of the build. It seems like a good time to talk about Rain of Arrows as a skill, because this isn't just a Rain of Arrows build, it's a Vaal Rain of Arrows build. For new players, a Vaal skill is an extension of your skill that can be used when you build up souls, and it gives you an additional buff. Vaal Rain of Arrows fires additional barrages of projectiles and it maims and slows enemies. It's a big DPS increase on bosses. So your goal as you're going throughout the campaign is to try and get a Vaal Rain of Arrows gem rather than a regular Rain of Arrows gem. And there are 3 ways to do this. You can either buy one from trade, they'll likely be 1 Chaos Orb. Secondly, after level 12, you can go into any Vaal side areas that you come across, and then from looting the chest at the end, it drops random Vaal gems. If one of these is Vaal Rain of Arrows, then that's your gem sorted. The third and final option, which is the one I normally go for, is if you use a Vaal Orb on a Rain of Arrows gem, it has a chance to turn that gem into the Vaal version. So what I tend to do is wait until I've got 3 to 4 Vaal Orbs, I'll go back to Act 1, buy 3 or 4 Rain of Arrows gems from the vendor and use Vaal Orbs on them to hope that it turns into the Vaal version. Once you get your Vaal Rain of Arrows, you essentially now have 2 skills from the same gem. So you run your Rain of Arrows as normal on your right click, and then you're going to assign the Vaal version to another button. You'll know it's the Vaal version because it'll have a counter that when you don't have any souls is set to 0. The way Vaal gems work is when you build up enough kills or hits on unique enemies, you get souls that give you triggers for your Vaal gem. You'll see it because there'll be a red pulsating circle on the gem, and Vaal Rain of Arrows has 2 charges. You're really saving these for bosses or tough encounters. So the way I normally use the Vaal version is if I come across an essence monster or a really tanky rare, or always on bosses, I'll use both my Vaal charges to give extra DPS on the boss, but also slow them and main them. It just makes them less deadly because they can't attack as quickly, and you'll get through that fight much quicker. So we're just going to run through how to proc Adrenaline and keep it up 100% of the time. So if we go to the passive tree, we'll see First to Strike, Last to Fall here. It confirms that we gain Adrenaline when we reach a low life. Now at the moment in Path of Exile, low life is 50% of your life. So as soon as your life gets below 50%, you proc Adrenaline for 20 seconds and you recover 25% of your life. So to get that to work, we need a skill that's going to basically take over half of our life, and that's where Corrupting Fever comes in. So you'll assign Corrupting Fever to a skill button, and as you can see here, if I use Corrupting Fever, it uses 1900 life, and I have 3295 life. So that's way more than half of my life. So if I proc Corrupting Fever, I hit the threshold of 50% life lost, and I gain Adrenaline for 20 seconds. So we'll click it there. I automatically gain the 25% life back. Then you can see up here in the buff bar, I have Adrenaline. Now, Adrenaline can't be overwritten. If I use it again, nothing happens. Adrenaline stays there. I obviously lose all my life, and I don't gain any back because I didn't proc the buff. So what I'd have to do is wait for my Adrenaline to run out, then press Corrupting Fever, and the Adrenaline comes back. There's a juggling part when you're leveling because you'll keep leveling up, and as you level up, you'll get more life, and it might be that Corrupting Fever doesn't take enough life. So in leveling, all you will need to do is link your Corrupting Fever up to life tap. Later on, you're probably going to have to add another support gem into it to boost it up. Think of it simply as long as this button here says it costs over half your life, then it's fine. Even if it uses 3/4, it's not the end of the world because you generate 25% back automatically. And really, you just want to get in the habit of using Corrupting Fever, then immediately your life flask, and you basically won't even notice that you've lost any life. And as I say, you need to wait for that to run out before you can proc it again. In terms of your bandits, you are killing all. And then for your Ascendancy, you're taking First to Strike, Last to Fall first so that we can get Adrenaline on board. which means when we have Onslaught and Kill and Adrenaline, we're absolutely zooming through the campaign zones. You then take in Unstoppable Hero followed by Fortitude to give us permanent fortification, and then some nice buffs to go along with it, including Cannot Be Stunned. And then for your Uber Lab, you're going to take Inspirational. It gives us a big boost to our non-curse auras, and it lets us run a banner with no reservation. So we can stick on Defiance banner to again boost up the armor and evasion. So as you can see on this character, got 40k armor and 60k evasion by running both Determination and Grace, which gives you big defenses, and it will boost your damage because of Perseverance. Obviously, when you're mapping, all your flasks are going to be up. And if you've also got any buffs around charges or anything, you'll get those. So with my buffs up, I've got 76k evasion and 51k armor. And then I just need to work on getting my chaos res a bit higher. And then the build is very, very tanky. So let's go over an end game character. So this is a gear I'd recommend that you farm up once you've killed the first 2 pinnacle bosses. Your gear doesn't need to be this good. Uber Elder and Maven were a breeze on this setup. But this is what I would aim for because it's also pretty much the build finished and you can do pretty much what content you want with the build. There is going to be a separate video that's going to cover off how to craft all of the gear for your endgame setup. So I'm not going to go through crafting. I'm just going to go through the stats that you want on each item. So for your bow, you want 1000 daily DPS there or thereabouts, attack speed and crit chance. These are easy to deterministically craft. It's about 6 to 8 divines, maybe less if you get lucky. Again, it's covered in the separate guide. Your helmet, you obviously want an enchant on this. It would be Rain of Arrows damage or Rain of Arrows attack speed, or you could go for mana reservation on something like Determination. So for your implicits, you want reduced mana cost of attacks. And then your other one, I'd recommend mana reservation efficiency, but you could also take physical damage from hits taken as any of the elements. And on this, we're just looking to get big life and resistances. If you can get increased armor and evasion, brilliant. It's just going to add to our defenses. Ignore the strength and intelligence. This is just something I had to craft on this particular character to hit my stat requirements. Your body armor, here is where you want massive armor and evasion. So if you can, you want hybrid armor and evasion, percentage armor and evasion, and flat armor and evasion. If I'd have crafted this properly and qualityed it to 28%, it would be over 2k armor and about 2.4k evasion. This adds massively to our defenses because of the way we scale them, and because of the belt that I'll come onto in a second, it gives you more damage. And then other than that, you're just looking for whatever resistances you need on the build. Ideally, you don't want life on this for 2 reasons. 1, it takes away an armor and evasion slot. 2, we can just get 15% mastery on the tree for life to make up for the fact it doesn't have life on the body armor. For your implicits, I'd definitely recommend Determination, increased aura effect, and increased effect of non-curse auras. The gloves, I would recommend trying to get huge accuracy on these because you want to free up points on the tree. If you don't get accuracy on your gear, you're going to need to spend 4 points on the tree to cap your accuracy. Then you just want big attack speed, big life, and then if you have an open prefix or an open suffix, craft something that's going to give you some damage, resistances, whatever it is that you need. For the implicits, I'd recommend increased accuracy, again, because it's going to mean we don't need to take nodes on the tree. And then I like gain 1 rage on hit with attacks. But I do feel that if you're only rolling with the lesser embers, it's not really very good because you're probably not going to generate all of your rage by the time your map is finished. So it might be worth just going for something like attack speed. The quiver, you just want to get as big a combination as you can of crit multi, flat damage, attack speed, and damage of bows. If you end up with life on it, brilliant. But I would sacrifice life to get a really, really big DPS quiver. Now the boots we will leave till last because this is if you want to be ailment immune, which costs probably 3 to 4 divines extra. If you don't want to spend that money, we can craft a different pair of boots for cheap and just do a few tweaks to our pantheons. So we'll go over the jewelry. The jewelry you essentially want -7 to non-channeling skills on both, big life and big resistances. That's it. Same for both rings. What you may need to do, because attributes may be a problem on the build, is you might want to get big strength on one of your rings. For the amulet, we're not going for non-channeling because we want to craft as much damage as we can on the amulet. I recommend getting as higher roll to all attributes as you can, and then roll with the catalyst to give you extra attributes, because you are going to struggle to cap both your strength and intelligence requirements without it. And then after that, it's just crit multi and life. And if you can get anything else on it, it's a bonus. For your anoint, if you're not 100% crit chance, I recommend high voltage. 100% crit chance is just bigger damage wise than any other anointment that you can put on your amulet. The belt is a unique belt that is normally dirt cheap at League Start and all the way through, which is Perseverance. What this belt does is gives us Onslaught when we're fortified, and we are always fortified. The other bonuses, it comes with percentage life and cold resistance, some armor and evasion, and it gives us 1% increased attack damage per 200 of the lowest armor and evasion. So the idea with the build, if you're going to run both Grace and Determination, is you balance your armor and evasion as close as you can to make the most of this bonus. But it is just increased attack damage, so it's not the biggest damage buff. It sounds more than it actually is, but it is still a decent chunk of damage to the build. And then lastly, we'll come on to the boots. So if you want to be ailment immune, you're going to need a unique jewel called Ancestral Vision. Ignore the tree, I was actually trying out a different build. So we have Ancestral Vision here, which essentially gives you ailment avoidance based on 50% of your spell suppression. And we have around 80% spell suppression taken away the lucky chance, because that won't get applied. So you need to find 60% on your gear and your tree. We have 20% on the tree here. So that means we just need to find 40% on boots, which is super easy. You just roll it with lesser embers to get your avoid ailments, and then you can craft it with essences of loathing. I would use shrieking essences because it's all you need. And then you're looking to essentially get life, movement speed, resistances, and avoid ailments. If you don't want to spend the money or Ancestral Vision is really expensive, I would just not bother with ailment immune. Just get some big boots with movement speed, life, and resistances. And what you're going to do is actually craft the movement speed, because you can unveil from Rin in Syndicate. You can unveil movement speed and cannot be chilled, which is absolutely massive because we want to try and get a way to avoid these ailments. Now, it only goes up to 20%. So you can see here, it's 18 to 20% movement speed, 100% chance to avoid being chilled. That sorts out your chill. You can take Brian King Pantheon, cannot be frozen, which means that covers all of the cold ailments. And then you would just take Soul of Gurakan for 60% reduced effective shock. You could, if you wanted to, maybe roll shock effect or ignite reduction on one of your flasks. But I honestly think 60% reduced effective shock, cannot be frozen, cannot be chilled is enough. You will get the odd massive ignite on certain bosses or map mods, but it's really not worth building around. So if you don't want to spend the money to be ailment immune, this is kind of the workaround that I would go with. And then for your flask, it's just a big evasion flask with increased evasion, crit chance with increased crit, armor flask with increased armor, and then a quicksilver with increased attack speed, and then a corrupted blood life flask. So that is a gear that is going to essentially finish the character. You're going to be able to do pretty much what you want with it. You could do invitations. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but if you wanted to, you can get them completed. You can go and do any mapping strategy you want. Things like Legion won't work great because they don't synergize that well with Rain of Arrows. But other than that, we're tanky, we're quick, and we're going to do a lot of damage. So it'd be really good for things like Sanctum and any mechanic really where you want to be quick across the ground, get between packs, kill stuff, stay safe, and move on. So that pretty much covers off the build guide. It's shorter than my normal build guides because I'm going to bring out videos for each section, and there's going to be a written guide. So following up, there's going to be a video on how to level the build and how to progress your early maps and your non-crit variant. There's going to be a video coming out on how to transition to crit, how to craft your early crit gear, and how to craft your endgame Uber Elder crit gear. And then there'll be a final video going through how I plan to progress my Atlas and make enough currency to craft or buy all this gear within the first week of the league. Thank you very much for watching. Hope everyone has a good league start. Take care and see you in the next one.